she clutched a silver portrait of a handsome stranger, her ticket to a new life of dignity. But as the locomotive's steam cleared, she was met by a toothless, rotting relic of a man who smelled of rancid fat and cold earth. He had bought her with a 20-year-old lie. Now, trapped in the middle of a wasteland with no money for a return ticket, she realizes the ranch is just a hole in the dirt. Her silk dress is about to become a burial shroud. The American continent in the late 19th century was not a land of opportunity, but a vast, indifferent digestive system. It consumed the weak and the hopeful with equal apathy, grinding their bones into the dust of the Great Plains to facilitate an expansion that was purely mechanical in its cruelty. The movement toward the setting sun functioned as a grand biological experiment in which humanity was merely the fuel for an insatiable furnace of progress. This was a geography of predation, where the promise of a new life served as the ultimate lure for those already drowning in the industrial filth of the eastern seaboard. In cities like Boston and New York, the air was thick with the stench of coal smoke and the metallic tang of blood from the massive slaughterhouses. Tens of thousands of young women found themselves trapped in the gears of a society that had no use for them beyond the loom or the brothel. Their lives were measured in pennies and the slow erosion of their health in cramped tenements where sunlight never reached the damp floor. For these desperate souls, the prospect of the West appeared as a clean, white shroud, hiding the rot of the reality that awaited them beyond the horizon. The mechanism of the trap was simple, elegant, and printed on cheap, yellowing newsprint that smelled of chemical ink and despair. Advertisements in the matrimonial column spoke of prosperity, of sprawling acreages of fertile soil, and of lonely men seeking the civilizing influence of a good woman. These words were often composed by men who had forgotten the sound of a human voice other than their own guttural grunts. The ink on the page was a chemical promise, a contract signed in the shadow of impending starvation and the crushing weight of social obsolescence for any woman without a dowry. Central to this deception was the daguerreotype, a silvered mirror that captured a moment of performative grace and froze it in a state of permanent falsehood. A man standing in a dusty, lawless territory would send a likeness taken 20 years prior, when his teeth were still seated firmly in his gums and his eyes were clear. Sometimes, the image was not even his own, but a discarded portrait of a stranger purchased from a traveling charlatan for 50 cents. The image promised a partner of vigor and health, a lie etched in silver and light that functioned as a visual toxin for the unwary. In reality, the suitors were often nothing more than walking corpses, their bodies ravaged by the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival and untreated disease. Years of subsistence on rancid salt pork and contaminated water had turned their digestive tracts into scarred battlefields of parasites. Their skin was no longer a protective membrane but a map of scars, burns, and the indelible stains of soil that no amount of lye soap could ever remove. They were the broken tools of a burgeoning empire, seeking to acquire a female counterpart only to share the burden of their slow, agonizing physical dissolution. The state looked upon this exchange with a cold, administrative eye, recognizing that a stable colony required the anchoring presence of reproductive bodies. To the architects of expansion, these brides were not individuals with aspirations, but essential livestock required for the pacification of the wild. Marriage was the legal framework used to bind a woman to a patch of dirt and a man she had never met, ensuring that the next generation of laborers would be born. It was an economic transaction disguised as a romantic endeavor, a trade of reproductive labor for a hollow, fragile promise of physical security. A young woman, perhaps 22 years of age, would spend her final weeks in the East preparing a trousseau that was utterly useless for the environment. She would sew delicate lace into collars and pack gowns made of silk and muslin, believing she was preparing for a life of domestic dignity and Victorian grace. Each stitch was a step further into the abyss, a frantic attempt to cling to the remnants of a civilization that had already discarded her as surplus. Her trunk was filled with the relics of a world she would never see again, a collection of fragile objects doomed to be destroyed. The iron horse was the primary delivery system for this biological freight, a screaming mass of steam and grease that tore through the landscape with violent indifference. The locomotive did not care for the cargo it carried, whether it was crates of rifles, bags of grain, or terrified women clutching faded photographs. It was a mechanical parasite, feeding on the coal of the earth and the hopes of the passengers to propel itself toward the desolate, dry interior. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks sounded like a countdown to the finality of their arrival at the edge of the world. Inside the cars, the atmosphere was a toxic slurry of coal soot, human sweat, and the sour odor of cheap biscuits and unwashed wool. The women huddled together, their eyes fixed on the blurring landscape that grew increasingly hostile and barren with every passing mile of the journey. The lush greenery of the east withered away, replaced by the jagged, skeletal remains of trees and the endless, rolling monotony of the high plains. They were moving through a graveyard of dreams, though they did not yet recognize the tombstones that lined the path to their new homes. Physical degradation began almost immediately as the journey stretched into weeks of constant motion and poor nutrition in the swaying carriages. The vibrations of the train rattled their bones and unsettled their stomachs, while the lack of water for washing led to the swift onset of skin irritations. Parasites found new hosts among the lace and ribbons, thriving in the warmth of bodies that were slowly being drained of their youthful vitality. The women were becoming part of the landscape before they had even set foot upon it, their refinement stripped away by the sheer friction of the voyage. Every mile west was a mile further from the possibility of escape, a psychological weight that pressed down on their chests like a physical burden of stone. The cost of a ticket back to the east was a fortune they did not possess, and the social stigma of a failed marriage was a death sentence. They were trapped by the very geography they had chosen to traverse, locked in a moving cage that offered only one exit, the station where their new life would begin. The fear was a cold, stagnant pool in their bellies, hidden behind forced, trembling smiles and the desperate, silent prayers of the lost. When the train finally ground to a halt at a whistle stop that was little more than a pile of rotting timber, the moment of revelation arrived. The air here was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of parched earth and the metallic tang of the nearby rusted tracks. There was no music, no fanfare, only the indifferent whistle of the engine and the harsh cry of a scavenger bird circling overhead in the pale sky. The platform was a stage where the final act of the deception would be played out in the harsh, unforgiving light of the western sun. Stepping down from the carriage, the bride would squint against the glare, her eyes searching for the handsome face from the daguerreotype she held. Instead, she was met by a landscape of grim reality, where the figures standing in the dust looked less like men and more like geological formations. They were stooped and gnarled, their clothing caked in layers of filth that had become a second skin, their hands like claws designed for digging. The discrepancy between the photograph and the person was not merely a matter of age, but a fundamental betrayal of the very senses. The men looked at these women with a predatory hunger that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with the acquisition of a resource. To them, the bride was a tool, a cook, a laundress, and a vessel for offspring, all wrapped in a package of rapidly deteriorating Eastern finery. There was no greeting of warmth, only the cold assessment of a farmer checking the teeth of a new mule before a long day. The lace and the silk were irrelevant to them, all that mattered was the strength of the back and the endurance of the spirit. As the train pulled away, leaving a trail of black smoke against the pale sky, the isolation became absolute and suffocating for the woman. She stood on the threshold of a new existence, realizing that the man holding her hand was a stranger whose very presence was a monument to a lie. The silence of the plains was a physical force, drowning out the memories of the life she had left behind and replacing them with struggle. This was the first day of the rest of her life, a life that would be measured in the slow, agonizing accumulation of dust. The expansion of the American frontier was not merely a conquest of land, but a sophisticated system of biological and social arbitrage. At the heart of this machinery lay the printing press, a cold engine of industrial deceit that churned out thousands of invitations to a slow, dusty death. These newspapers, distributed throughout the cramped, soot-stained cities of the East, functioned as the primary delivery system for a specific type of economic toxin. The columns filled with matrimonial advertisements were not seeking love, they were seeking the recruitment of fresh labor and reproductive capacity to stabilize a volatile, decaying environment. Each advertisement was a carefully crafted hook, designed to catch the eye of those for whom the present was a suffocating cage of industrial poverty and the future was a void. The paper itself was a testament to the low value of the lives it manipulated, being of a coarse, yellowish quality that held the scent of cheap oil and chemical bleach. It was the medium through which a man sitting in a sod house in Kansas could project a phantom version of himself into a parlor in Philadelphia. This was the beginning of the transaction, where the desperation of the frontier met the starvation of the urban center. The words were chosen with a predatory precision, promising a domesticity that did not exist and a prosperity that was nothing more than a fever dream born of isolation. For the women reading these lines, the ink represented a doorway, but they failed to see that the door led directly into a slaughterhouse of the spirit. In the desolate shacks that dotted the territories, men with hands calloused into permanent claws would hunched over rough-hewn tables to compose their letters of intent. The air in these dwellings was a thick slurry of wood smoke, the smell of unwashed wool, and the metallic tang of cheap tobacco. These men were often the physical remnants of failed ventures, their lungs scarred by the dust of mines or the relentless wind of the plains. Their fingers, thick and clumsy from years of wrestling with frozen earth and stubborn livestock, struggled to hold the pens that would write the most elegant lies of their lives. They were not writing to find a partner, but to acquire a vital resource that could cook, clean, and endure the brutal winters. The contrast between the hand that wrote and the words it produced was a profound manifestation of the era's fundamental dishonesty. A man whose mouth was a graveyard of broken, yellowed teeth would describe himself as being in the prime of his health. A farmer whose entire worldly possession consisted of a dying mule and a mortgage-ridden patch of clay would speak of a vast estate and the quiet dignity of a landowner. The language of the Victorian era, with its floral metaphors and rigid social codes, provided the perfect camouflage for this biological desperation. It allowed the grim reality of a survivalist existence to be dressed in the velvet rags of romantic courtship, masking the stench of the grave with the scent of paper and ink. Central to this grand deception was the daguerreotype, a technological marvel that served as the ultimate weapon in the arsenal of the Western charlatan. A man would travel 40 miles to the nearest settlement to visit a traveling photographer, a man who traded in the preservation of vanity for silver coins. There, in a temporary studio that smelled of ether and iodine, the frontiersman would pose against a painted backdrop of a grand library or a manicured garden. He would borrow a clean coat from the photographer, a garment that had been worn by 100 other liars before him. For one brief, chemical moment, his weathered face was frozen in a state of artificial respectability, scrubbed of the reality of his existence. Oftentimes, the deception went even deeper, involving the use of portraits that were 20 years old or belonged to entirely different men who had long since perished. A young woman in the East would gaze upon the image of a handsome, clear-eyed youth and believe she was seeing her future, unaware that the man who sent it was now a gnarled, 60-year-old wreck. The silver plate of the daguerreotype acted as a mirror that reflected only the viewer's hopes, while the reality of the sender remained hidden in the shadows of the frontier. The chemical process of photography, involving the stabilization of light on a surface, was used to destabilize the truth of a human life, turning a visual record into a tool of entrapment. For the women of the eastern cities, the lure was irresistible because the alternative was a life of gradual, mechanical erasure in the factories. The textile mills of the north were monuments to the consumption of human vitality, where the air was a fog of cotton lint that settled in the lungs like a white shroud. A woman of 25 years in such an environment was already considered an aging commodity, her value depreciating with every 12-hour shift at the loom. To her, the West represented a return to a perceived natural order, a chance to be a queen of the prairie rather than a ghost in the machine. She was trading one form of industrial exploitation for a more primitive, visceral type of subjugation. The sociology of the era dictated that a woman's survival was tethered to her marital status, a fact that the men of the West exploited with cold, calculated efficiency. Marriage was the only legal and social framework that allowed a woman to move across the continent without being branded a social pariah or a common prostitute. This necessity created a market where the demand for security was met by a supply of fraudulent promises. The correspondence that traveled back and forth across the thousands of miles was a bridge built of paper, over which the biological future of the nation was transported. Every letter was a brick in a wall that would eventually enclose the woman in a life of unimaginable hardship and isolation. As the months of correspondence passed, the woman would begin the process of liquidating her meager life in the East. She would sell her few possessions to afford the trunk and the basic supplies required for the journey, often relying on the men to send the funds for the railway ticket. This transfer of money was the final binding element of the contract, a financial tether that ensured she had no means of retreat once the journey began. The 400 or 500 miles that separated her from her destination were not just a geographical distance, but a psychological chasm that grew wider with every passing day. She was being purchased, though the transaction was couched in the language of a dowry or a gift. The railway station, on the day of departure, was a place of frantic, chaotic energy, a sensory overload of steam, iron, and the weeping of families. The locomotive was a black, iron beast that breathed fire and exhaled thick, choking clouds of soot, a mechanical representation of the unstoppable force of expansion. As the woman boarded the train, she felt the first true tremors of the trap closing. The heavy velvet seats of the carriage were damp with the humidity of 1,000 previous passengers, and the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and fear. She clutched her small bag, containing the deceptive photograph and the letters of false promise, as if they were talismans against the encroaching unknown. The iron horse began its rhythmic, violent pounding against the rails, a sound that mimicked the heartbeat of a civilization that was eating itself to grow. Every rotation of the wheels took her further into a landscape that was increasingly alien and indifferent to her presence. The lush, green hills of the Atlantic coast gave way to the jagged, skeletal forests of the interior, and then finally to the flat, brown expanse of the Great Plains. This was the transformation of the world from a place of human scale to a place of geological indifference. She was no longer a person with a history, she was a unit of colonization, a biological seed being cast into the wind to see if it would take root or wither in the dust. During the days of travel, the physical sensation of the journey became a process of attrition. The constant vibration of the train loosened the pins in her hair and the stitching in her clothes, reflecting the slow disintegration of her social identity. The lack of proper facilities meant that the refinement she had cultivated was being stripped away by the sheer grit of the environment. Her skin became coated in a fine layer of gray ash from the engine, a precursor to the dust that would define her life on the ranch. She was being prepared, through a process of environmental osmosis, for the harsh reality that awaited her at the end of the line. The isolation of the high plains was a physical weight that pressed against the windows of the train, a void that seemed to swallow the very light of the sun. There were no trees to break the horizon, only the endless, undulating sea of grass that moved like the skin of a dying animal. The small settlements they passed were nothing more than scars on the earth, collections of rotting wood and rusted iron that seemed to be in the process of being reclaimed by the soil. It was a geography of failure, yet the woman clung to the image in the daguerreotype, using the lie to shield herself from the evidence of her own eyes. By the time the train reached the final station, the woman was a hollowed-out version of the person who had boarded it. The exhaustion was not just physical, but existential, a deep-seated realization that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. The platform was a desolate stretch of timber, surrounded by a landscape that looked as though it had never known the touch of a compassionate hand. She stepped down into the dust, her silk skirt immediately stained by the alkaline earth, and looked around for the men who had promised her a kingdom. The silence of the plains was her only greeting, a cold and hollow sound that heralded the beginning of her long, slow dissolution in the name of progress. This was the true face of the Western migration, a systematic harvest of hope, fueled by the cold pragmatism of a nation that viewed its citizens as replaceable parts. The mail-order bride system was the quintessential expression of this philosophy, a way to lure the necessary biological components into a hostile environment using the most sophisticated lies available. The tragedy was not just in the individual suffering, but in the realization that the entire edifice of the frontier was built upon these fraudulent foundations. Behind every pioneer family stood a history of deception, a secret kept in a silver frame, and a woman who had discovered, too late, that she had been sold for the price of a train ticket and a handful of ink-stained promises. The iron horse was not merely a vehicle of transport but a mobile purgatory, a rattling iron furnace that slowly incinerated the last vestiges of Eastern refinement. For 6 days and 7 nights, the women were trapped in a vibrating cage of soot and recycled breath, hurtling toward a destiny they had only seen through the lens of a deceptive camera. The air inside the passenger cars was a stagnant slurry of coal smoke, the sour stench of unwashed wool, and the metallic tang of anxiety. Every mile traversed was a layer of skin stripped away from their previous identities, leaving them raw and exposed to the biting winds of the interior. The luxury promised in the brochures was revealed to be a farce, replaced by hard wooden benches and the constant, bone-jarring rhythm of the tracks. Physiological degradation was the first toll demanded by the journey into the void. The elaborate undergarments of the era, designed for the cool parlors of Boston or Philadelphia, became instruments of slow, agonizing torture in the stifling heat of the plains. Corsets, tightened with the desperate hope of maintaining social standards, acted as iron bands that restricted the lungs and bit into the flesh with every jolt of the carriage. In the absence of water for washing, the sweat of a dozen women pooled beneath their heavy stays, creating a breeding ground for rashes and fungal infections that went untreated for 1,000 miles. The skin beneath the fine lace began to fester, a hidden reality of rot that mimicked the moral decay of the entire westward expansion. Dietary neglect further hollowed out their bodies as the train moved deeper into the territories. The food sold at the whistle stops was a grim collection of rancid salt pork, hard biscuits teeming with weevils, and coffee that tasted of boiled leather and alkaline dust. Their digestive systems, accustomed to the predictable rhythms of the city, rebelled against the onslaught of grease and contaminants. Dehydration set in, turning their complexions into a sallow, parchment-like mask and making their eyes appear sunken and predatory. They were no longer the vibrant brides of the daguerreotypes, but biological husks being transported across a landscape that viewed them only as cargo. The landscape itself was an active participant in their psychological dismantling, a vast, undulating sea of brown and gray that offered no comfort to the eye. As they crossed the borders of Nebraska and moved into the high deserts of Wyoming, the horizon seemed to recede into infinity, mocking the very concept of human scale. There were no trees to provide shelter from the relentless glare of a sun that seemed to burn with a cold, indifferent fire. The silence of the plains, broken only by the mournful whistle of the locomotive, was a physical weight that pressed against the windows of the train. It was the sound of a territory that had not yet been broken, a geography that was preparing to consume them whole. At night, the interior of the car became a theater of misery where the boundaries of social class and modesty were finally extinguished. Women who had never shared a room with a stranger found themselves huddled together for warmth, their heads resting on the shoulders of the broken and the desperate. The darkness was filled with the sounds of suppressed weeping and the low, guttural coughs of those whose lungs were already failing under the weight of the coal dust. The kerosene lamps flickered with a jaundiced light, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper of the carriage. They were a cargo of ghosts, being delivered to a graveyard of dreams that stretched from the Missouri River to the Pacific. The arrival at the designated station was not a moment of triumph, but a sudden, violent confrontation with the lie that had sustained them. When the train finally ground to a halt at a collection of rotting timber shacks, the transition from the mechanical world to the biological world was complete. The air outside was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of parched earth and the unmistakable stench of the stockyards. The platform was a desolate stage where the curtain was about to rise on a tragedy of errors, played out in the harsh, unforgiving light of a western afternoon. The bride would step down from the iron steps, her silk dress immediately caked in a layer of fine, gray dust that seemed to rise from the very pores of the earth. The first sight of the man waiting on the platform was like the sudden opening of a deep, infected wound. He was never the dapper gentleman with the clear eyes and the straight back whose image had been cherished in a locket for months. Instead, the woman was met by a creature of the soil, a man whose body had been twisted and gnarled by the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival. His face was a map of deep, sun-baked crevices, and his eyes were clouded by cataracts and the dullness of a mind that had spent too long in the company of beasts. He stood there with a predatory patience, his hands like blackened roots, waiting to claim the property he had purchased with a handful of silver and a mountain of lies. The stench of him was the final, overwhelming blow to the senses, a physical manifestation of his primitive existence. He smelled of rancid animal fat, of the acrid smoke of dried buffalo dung, and the cloying, sweet odor of cheap whiskey that permeated his very pores. There was no warmth in his gaze, only the cold, transactional assessment of a man who was looking at a beast of burden. To him, the woman was not a partner or a companion, but a functional necessity, a biological machine required to keep the ranch from being reclaimed by the wilderness. The discrepancy between the photograph and the person was a chasm that could never be bridged by words, for the men had forgotten how to speak the language of the heart. A profound, sickening realization would wash over the woman as the train pulled away, its rhythmic clatter sounding like the final clicking of a padlock. She stood alone in a landscape that offered no refuge, tethered to a man who was a living monument to deception. Her small trunk, containing the relics of her former life, sat in the dust like a coffin, a reminder of everything she had sacrificed for a promise that was written in sand. The realization that there was no return journey, that her life was now the legal and physical property of this stranger, was a weight that threatened to collapse her lungs. She was trapped in the center of an empty continent, a victim of a system that viewed her as nothing more than an expendable unit of colonization. Economic reality was the ultimate jailer in this vast, open-air prison. The ticket to the West had cost her every penny she possessed, and the social institutions of the 19th century offered no recourse for a woman who had been defrauded. To return to the East would require a small fortune she would never earn, and to leave the men would be to embrace a slow death by exposure or starvation in the wilderness. The law of the territory was the law of the husband, a legal framework that treated the wife as a subsidiary of the estate, as essential and as overlooked as a well or a fence. She was a prisoner of the horizon, bound by a contract that was signed in ink but would be paid for in blood and toil. The men would eventually gesture toward a wagon, a skeletal structure of wood and iron that looked as though it were being held together by rust and prayer. This was to be her chariot, the vehicle that would carry her to the subterranean hole he called a home. As she climbed into the seat, the rough wood snagging her fine stockings, she could feel the eyes of the few onlookers, mostly men with the same hollow, desperate look, watching her with a mixture of pity and indifference. They had seen this drama play out 100 times before, a repeating cycle of biological recruitment that kept the wheels of progress turning. To them, she was just another shipment of the resource known as womanhood, arriving to replace the last one that had been broken by the land. The journey from the station to the ranch was a slow, agonizing descent into the reality of her new environment. The wagon jolted over ruts and rocks, each impact sending a shock through her spine and further loosening the pins in her carefully styled hair. The man said nothing, his attention fixed on the backs of the horses, his silence a wall that she could not hope to penetrate. The world she had known, the music of the theater, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of laughter in a crowded street, felt like a dream from another life. Here, the only music was the creaking of the wheels and the occasional, sharp crack of the whip against the air. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky, the true scale of her isolation became apparent. There were no lights on the horizon, no signs of other human habitations, only the endless, rolling monotony of the grass. The air grew cold with a sudden, predatory intensity, and the woman huddled into her thin shawl, realizing that she was utterly alone in a universe that did not care if she lived or died. The man beside her was not a protector, but a master, and the land ahead of her was not a home, but a grave in waiting. This was the foundation of the empire, a landscape of stolen labor, built on a foundation of lies and maintained by the sheer impossibility of escape. The sociology of the frontier was built upon this fundamental act of betrayal, a system where the strong preyed upon the hopeful to ensure the survival of the collective. Every successful ranch, every growing town, was fueled by the hidden suffering of women who had been lured across the continent by a false image. They were the silent architects of the West, their lives consumed by the furnace of expansion, their identities erased by the dust and the demands of the soil. As the wagon finally approached the low, dark mound of the sod house, the woman understood that her transformation had truly begun. She was no longer a bride, she was a survivor, entering a world where the only truth was the cold, hard weight of the earth. The architectural reality of the Western dream was not a manor of timber and stone, but a subterranean wound in the earth known as the dugout. As the wagon creaked to a final, shuddering halt, the bride beheld her kingdom, a low, dark mound of parched turf that barely rose above the level of the horizon. There were no windows to welcome the sun, only a singular, gaping aperture that led into the cold, damp bowels of the soil. This was the promised ranch, a primitive burrow where the boundary between the human and the vermin was eroded by the sheer necessity of survival. The earth did not offer a foundation for a life, it simply opened its maw to swallow the individual before they had even begun to breathe the thin, alkaline air of the high plains. Inside the dugout, the atmosphere was a thick, stagnant soup of decaying organic matter and the metallic tang of deep-crust minerals. The ceiling was a chaotic tangle of dried grass roots and shifting dirt, from which small clods of earth fell with a rhythmic, indifferent frequency. During the rainy season, the roof became a weeping sore, dripping a brown, viscous fluid onto the floor, which was nothing more than packed clay and dried animal waste. In this dim, lightless space, the senses were assaulted by the smell of wet fur, stale sweat, and the acrid smoke of dried buffalo dung burning in a primitive hearth. It was an environment designed for the slow, biological dissolution of any creature that dared to call it a home. The woman's trousseau, the collection of silks and laces she had painstakingly assembled in the East, was the first casualty of this new, subterranean existence. A gown of blue silk, intended for a life of domestic dignity, was stripped of its purpose and reduced to its base material value. Within weeks, the delicate fabric was stained with grease and soot, the intricate embroidery becoming a trap for lice and sand fleas that migrated from the walls of the dwelling. Eventually, the silk was torn into strips to serve as bandages for infected cuts or to plug the gaps in the door where the winter wind howled like a starving wolf. Refinement was a luxury that the biology of the frontier could not afford, and it was discarded with the same cold pragmatism that a farmer shows toward a diseased limb. Life in the dugout was a relentless, microscopic war against the pervasive presence of dirt, a substance that colonized every crevice of the body and every morsel of food. The water, hauled from a stagnant creek or a deep, alkaline well, carried the taste of ancient minerals and the invisible parasites of the plains. Every meal was a grit-filled trial, as the wind-blown dust of the territory settled into the cooking pots and the bread dough. The woman's skin, once soft and pale, began to take on the texture of the landscape itself, dry, cracked, and perpetually stained with the gray soot of the hearth. There was no such thing as cleanliness in a world made of mud. There was only the temporary management of filth before the next dust storm arrived to reclaim the territory. In the economy of the frontier, the woman was repositioned from a social partner to a multifunctional biological asset, a hybrid of a pack animal and an industrial tool. Her labor was the hidden energy that allowed the men to focus on the external conquest of the land, yet it was a labor that left no monument other than her own physical decline. She spent her days hauling heavy buckets of water across uneven ground, her spine beginning to bow under a weight that the letters had never mentioned. She butchered the carcasses of livestock, her hands perpetually caked in the cooling blood and yellow fat of beasts, a visceral reality that shattered the Victorian illusions of her upbringing. She was a gear in a machine that ran on calories and suffering, a human component whose only value lay in her continued functionality. The physical toll of this labor manifested as a premature aging that was both rapid and horrifyingly complete. By the time she had spent 2 years in the dugout, her hands had transformed into scarred, calloused claws, the fingernails broken and blackened by the constant contact with soil and lye. Her joints, inflamed by the cold and the repetitive strain of heavy lifting, creaked with a sound that mimicked the wagon wheels. The lack of fresh vegetables and the reliance on salted meats led to the early signs of scurvy, her gums softening and her teeth beginning to loosen in their sockets. She was being physically consumed by the territory, her vitality drained to nourish the roots of a civilization that would never know her name. Beyond her labor, the woman was required to fulfill her primary biological mandate, the production of the next generation of laborers. In the eyes of the men and the state, her womb was a factory, a necessary incubator for the human stock required to populate the void. Pregnancy was not a period of grace, but a 9-month sentence of increased vulnerability in an environment that offered no protection. She was expected to maintain her grueling work schedule even as her body shifted and groaned under the weight of the developing fetus. There were no prenatal vitamins, no midwives with clean hands, only the deepening dread of the inevitable day when the child would demand its entry into a world of dust and cold. When the labor finally began, it occurred in the dim, flea-ridden shadows of the dugout, far from any hope of medical intervention. The woman lay on a pallet of straw and dirty blankets, her screams swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the surrounding prairie. The only assistance available was often the man himself, whose hands were more accustomed to the rough hide of a cow than the delicate membranes of a birthing mother. There was no ether for the pain, no antiseptic for the instruments, only the raw, animal reality of flesh tearing and blood spilling onto the dirt floor. It was a scene of primal horror, where the miracle of life was overshadowed by the very real possibility of a septic death. If the woman survived the ordeal, she emerged not as a mother in the romantic sense, but as a survivor of a biological trauma that would leave her permanently altered. Childbirth in the wilderness frequently resulted in internal scarring, uterine prolapse, or chronic infections that lingered for years in the absence of proper care. Her body was a battlefield that had been trampled by the demands of expansion, leaving her with a lingering frailty that the harsh environment would eventually exploit. She would attempt to nurse the infant while her own body was starving for nutrients, a desperate cycle of biological desperation where the mother was hollowed out to provide a tenuous chance of survival for the child. Infant mortality was the silent reaper that haunted every dugout, a statistical certainty that turned the landscape into a sprawling cemetery for the unnamed. A child born in the dirt often perished in the dirt, their lungs unable to cope with the soot or their systems succumbing to the cold of a sudden blizzard. The woman would be forced to watch as her offspring withered from simple infections or digestive ailments that a spoonful of clean water might have cured. The burial would take place on a small rise of land behind the dwelling, a shallow hole dug in the frozen earth, marked only by a pile of stones to keep the coyotes away. There was no time for prolonged mourning. The economy of the ranch demanded that she return to the hearth and the plow before the sun had set. The psychological result of this constant attrition was a state of profound, catatonic numbness that historians have sometimes mislabeled as frontier resilience. It was not strength, but the death of the emotional self, a protective shell grown over a spirit that had been beaten into submission by the elements. The woman would stand in the doorway of her burrow, staring out at the horizon with eyes that no longer saw beauty or hope, but only the next day's worth of toil. This was the frontier stare, a visual manifestation of a mind that had retreated into the deepest recesses of the psyche to escape the sensory nightmare of the present. She was a ghost inhabiting a living body, a casualty of a war she had never agreed to fight. The sociology of the era viewed this suffering as a necessary cost of doing business, a sacrifice required to transform the wilderness into a productive asset. The state encouraged these unions because a man with a wife and child was a man who was anchored to the land, a taxpayer, and a soldier for the cause of progress. The fact that the anchor was forged from the broken bones and shattered dreams of a woman was irrelevant to the grand design of the nation. Civilization, acting as a predatory virus, used these individuals as disposable hosts, extracting their labor and their reproductive power before discarding them into the dust of history. The dugout was the laboratory where the human soul was distilled into its most basic, survivalist elements. As the years passed, the woman became indistinguishable from the earth she inhabited, her identity entirely subsumed by the requirements of the territory. The letters she had once written to the east became fewer and further between, until they ceased entirely, for she no longer had any words that could bridge the gap between her reality and theirs. She had become a part of the geology of the West, a layer of sediment in the history of the plains. The cruel irony was that her presence made the land more valuable for those who would come after, those who would build the actual mansions on top of the ruins of her subterranean prison. In the final analysis, the story of the mail-order bride is the story of the biological foundation of an empire, a history written in the fluids of the birthing bed and the filth of the sod house. It is a narrative of profound injustice, where the most vulnerable members of society were lured into a trap of geographical isolation and economic servitude. The dugout was not a home, but a monument to the lengths to which a society will go to secure its own expansion. Behind the myth of the pioneer family lies the reality of the woman in the dirt, a human being who was reduced to a function and whose only legacy was a shallow grave beneath a sky that did not care to remember her face. The hands were the first to surrender their history, shedding the memory of velvet and ivory for the calloused reality of the soil. Once, these fingers might have danced across the keys of a pianoforte in a sunlit parlor, but now they were merely jagged tools of bone and thickened skin. The fingernails, once meticulously trimmed and buffed, were now permanently stained with the dark, iron-rich blood of butchered livestock and the gray ash of the hearth. Every knuckle was swollen with the onset of premature arthritis, a biological price paid for hauling heavy buckets of water across the frozen crust of the prairie. They no longer belonged to a woman of social standing, they were the functional appendages of a biological unit designed for the extraction of resources from a hostile landscape. The face followed the hands into the abyss of anonymity, as the sun and wind performed a slow, methodical flaying of the persona. The porcelain complexion that had been the pride of a city girl was replaced by a map of deep, sun-baked fissures and alkaline burns. Each year spent in the shadow of the horizon added layers of leatherized tissue, a protective mask grown to withstand the relentless assault of the dust. Her eyes, which once sparkled with the curiosity of the educated classes, had become dull and predatory, fixed perpetually on the immediate requirements of the next hour. This was the frontier stare, a visual manifestation of a spirit that had retreated into the deepest catacombs of the psyche to avoid the sensory horror of the present. Domesticity in the dugout was a grim, chemical process of conversion, where the art of the home was reduced to the science of survival. The kitchen was not a place of nourishment, but a site of visceral desecration where the woman spent her hours knee-deep in the fluids of the harvest. She learned to plunge her arms into the cooling cavities of deer and cattle, her skin absorbing the metallic tang of the kill until she could no longer wash it away. The gowns she had brought from the east were now unrecognizable heaps of gray rags, mended with thick, uneven stitches of sinew and coarse thread. Every action was a calculated move in a game of calories, where the expenditure of energy was weighed against the probability of another day of existence. The husband, the architect of this grand deception, observed this transformation with the cold indifference of a man who had successfully installed a piece of machinery. In his primitive hierarchy of values, the fraud he had committed with the daguerreotype was not a moral failing, but a necessary act of survival. He felt no more guilt for lying to his wife than he did for tricking a fish with a baited hook. Both were essential methods of securing the fuel required for his expansion. To him, the woman's suffering was merely a side effect of her adaptation, a shedding of useless eastern skin that made her a more efficient worker. He had purchased a partner to share his burden, and the fact that the contract was based on a lie was a detail long since buried under the snows of 10 winters. Their union was a study in mutual parasitism, a bond forged not by the warmth of affection but by the chilling realization that to be alone was to perish. They lived in a state of transactional silence, where words were reserved for commands and the negotiation of labor. The men provided the raw materials of survival, the meat, the fuel, the protection of the rifle, while the woman provided the labor of conversion and the promise of a future generation. It was a cold, biological arrangement that mirrored the indifference of the land itself, a landscape where the strong consumed the weak to maintain the momentum of the species. This was the true foundation of the new nation, a collection of fractured souls bound together by the impossibility of escape. Nature acted as a silent, unrelenting executioner, stripping away every vestige of individuality until only the most functional elements remained. The seasons were not periods of beauty, but distinct modes of torture, each designed to test the structural integrity of the human body. In the summer, the heat was a physical weight that pressed the breath from the lungs and turned the skin into a blistered ruin. In the winter, the cold was a predatory beast that crept through the cracks in the sod, seeking the heat of the blood and turning the extremities into blackened, necrotic tissue. The woman learned to exist in a state of permanent physiological tension, her body always braced for the next blow from an environment that wanted her dead. Psychological erosion was the final stage of the metamorphosis, as the isolation of the plains began to dissolve the boundaries of the self. The silence of the territory was not a peaceful thing, but a crushing vacuum that pulled the memories of the East from the mind and replaced them with the white noise of the wind. She began to forget the sound of her own name, for the husband only called her with a grunt or a gesture, and there were no neighbors to offer the mirror of conversation. Her internal world, once filled with poetry and song, was now a barren wasteland where the only thoughts were of the grain supply and the integrity of the roof. She was becoming a piece of the geology, a sentient layer of dust in a world made of nothing else. Social institutions were irrelevant in this subterranean existence, as the law of the territory was the law of the shovel and the gun. There was no court of appeals for the woman who had been lured by a false photograph, no social safety net to catch her as she fell into the abyss of poverty. The state encouraged this predatory recruitment because it provided the necessary population density to claim the land from its original inhabitants. Every broken woman in a sod house was a victory for the Department of the Interior, a biological anchor that ensured the permanence of the occupation. Civilization was a virus that used the individual as a disposable host, and she was merely one of millions of cells being consumed to fuel the growth of the organism. As the years stretched into a decade, the woman's body became a monument to the labor she had performed, a physical record of the frontier's demands. Her spine was permanently curved from the weight of the water yokes, and her skin was a patchwork of scars from the fire, the knife, and the frost. She had given birth to 5 children in the dirt, 3 of whom had been returned to that same dirt before they could even walk. Each loss was not a moment of profound grief, but a dull, aching realization of the futility of her efforts, a realization she buried as deeply as the small, wooden boxes in the garden. She no longer had the luxury of emotion, she had only the requirement of endurance. The husband's own decay mirrored her own, as the two of them became like 2 gnarled trees growing in a desert, their roots entangled in a desperate search for moisture. He was a man of 60 years who looked 80, his lungs wheezing with the accumulated dust of 1,000 plowed acres. He still did not apologize for the lie, for to apologize would be to admit that his life was a failure, and he could not afford that admission while the winter was coming. They sat across from each other at the rough table, 2 strangers bound by a decade of shared misery, eating their salted pork in a silence that was more profound than any scream. They were the successful ones, the ones who had survived the recruitment and taken root in the iron soil. Sociological analysis of these frontier unions reveals a dark undercurrent of systemic fraud that was essential to the westward movement. The myth of the pioneer family, built on love and shared purpose, was a necessary fiction used to mask the reality of a social order founded on the exploitation of the desperate. The women were the primary victims of this arrangement, lured into a life of servitude by a marketing campaign of unprecedented cruelty and scale. Their lives were the currency with which the empire was bought, a currency that was spent without hesitation or remorse by the men and the governments who benefited from their labor. The West was not won by the bullet, it was won by the slow, agonizing sacrifice of women in the dirt. In the final assessment, the woman who had arrived at the station with her silk dresses and her dreams of dignity was gone, replaced by a creature that the East would not recognize. She was the final product of the frontier machine, a functional element of the landscape who had been polished by the grit of the plains into a state of hard, unyielding indifference. The tragedy was not that she had changed, but that the change was so complete that she no longer desired a return to her former self. She belonged to the earth now, a biological extension of the territory that had consumed her. As she looked out at the setting sun, she did not see a thing of beauty, but only a signal that it was time to close the door of the burrow and prepare for the long, cold night. The final assessment of the Western expansion reveals a landscape that is less a monument to human courage and more a sprawling, open-air laboratory for the systematic eradication of dignity. When we strip away the gilded layers of 19th-century propaganda, what remains is the cold, clinical report of a pathologist examining the remains of a society that consumed itself to grow. The frontier was not a place where individuals went to find themselves, but where they went to be hollowed out by the brutal arithmetic of economic necessity. Every successful ranch and every burgeoning township was a structure built upon a foundation of institutionalized fraud, where the primary currency was the broken spirit and the exhausted womb of the mail-order bride. The biological legacy of these unions, founded on the calculated deception of the daguerreotype and the ink-stained lie, was not a heritage of pride but a genetic transmission of trauma. The survivors of these parasitic arrangements passed down to their offspring a profound, unspoken memory of betrayal and the cold, hard pragmatism of the starved. There was no room for the luxury of emotional vulnerability in the children raised in the shadow of a subterranean dugout, only the inherited knowledge that trust was a liability and truth was a malleable tool. The history of the American West is, at its core, a lineage of silence, a series of generations who learned to bury their screams as deeply as they buried their dead in the alkaline soil of the plains. We look back at the sepia-toned photographs of those decades and see the stern, seemingly noble faces of the pioneers, but our modern eyes are being deceived by the same visual alchemy that ensnared the women of the East. Those portraits are not windows into the soul, but carefully constructed masks designed to hide the rot of the reality behind the lens. The stoicism we interpret as strength was often nothing more than the facial paralysis of the catatonic, a physiological shutdown in the face of insurmountable suffering. The silver plates and glass negatives captured the shell of the person, while the essence of their humanity had long since evaporated into the dry, indifferent wind of the territories. Behind the focused clarity of the historical record lie tens of thousands of broken destinies that have been excluded from the narrative because they serve no political or economic purpose. These are the lives that dissolved into the landscape without leaving a trace, the women whose names were never recorded in anything more permanent than a crumbling family Bible. Their stories are not told in the grand halls of academia or in the romanticized tales of the frontier, because their suffering was the very lubricant that allowed the machinery of progress to turn. To acknowledge the systemic horror of the mail-order bride system would be to admit that the entire edifice of the nation was constructed upon a foundation of sexual and labor-based enslavement. The sociology of the era treated the individual as an expendable host for the virus of civilization, a biological vehicle whose only mandate was to survive long enough to facilitate the next stage of infection. The state did not care if the woman in the sod house was happy or if her marriage was based on a lie, it only cared that she produced the laborers and the taxpayers of the future. The Wild West was the site of a profound biological and social reorganization, where the complexities of human identity were sacrificed on the altar of territorial acquisition. It was a world where the only measure of a life's value was its ability to endure the slow, grinding process of environmental and social attrition. The landscape itself remains as a mute witness to this process, an indifferent executioner that watched as the hopeful were transformed into the hardened. The coyotes and the wolves that prowled the edges of the settlements did not hear the music of a new nation being born, they heard the rhythmic, desperate struggle of a species trying to outrun its own decay. The prairie was never a garden waiting to be tamed, but a vast, predatory digestive system that eventually reclaimed every scrap of wood, every shard of bone, and every drop of sweat. The silence that covers the plains today is the same silence that greeted the brides at the railway station, a cold, hollow sound that echoes the finality of their entrapment. In the final accounting, the mail-order bride was the ultimate victim of the 19th century's obsession with expansion, a person who was lured across a continent by a phantom and then discarded by the system that used her. The catfishing of the cowboy era was not a humorous footnote in history, but a foundational act of violence that defined the terms of frontier survival. It was an era where the concept of love was replaced by the utilitarian function of a postage stamp, and where the hope for a better life was traded for a fraudulent portrait in a silver frame. The deception was complete, encompassing the past, the present, and the future of those who were caught in its gears. The economic expediency that drove men to send false photographs and women to board the trains has not vanished, it has merely evolved into new forms of social and biological arbitrage. The history of the West serves as a reminder that under the pressure of survival, the human animal will resort to any level of depravity to secure its continued existence. The pioneer myth is the ultimate lie, a collective delusion that allows us to look at the horrors of the 19th century and see only progress and heroism. But the truth remains buried in the dust of the dugouts, in the scarred hands of the women who freshwatered the cattle while their own spirits withered from the lack of a single honest word. Civilization, like any successful parasite, is adept at concealing the damage it does to its carriers, dressing the wounds of history in the finery of legend and lore. We choose to remember the grit and the glory because the alternative, the recognition of a systematic slaughter of human dignity, is too heavy a burden for the national consciousness to bear. The Wild West was a theater of the grotesque, a place where the most intimate human connections were corrupted by the demands of the frontier and the cold logic of the market. It was a time and place where the light of the sun was used to burn a lie into a silver plate, and where the promise of a home was merely a ticket to a subterranean grave. As we close this clinical report on the expansion of the frontier, we are left with the image of the woman standing on the platform, holding a photograph of a man who does not exist. She is the true icon of the era, the eternal victim of a world that viewed her as a resource rather than a soul. Her silk dress is already turning to gray in the dust, and the train that brought her has already vanished into the haze of the horizon, leaving her alone with the stranger who bought her for the price of a few stamps. There is no music, no redemption, only the onset of the long, cold night and the realization that the trap has finally, irrevocably, shut. This is the bitter irony of the historical record. The more we seek to humanize the past, the more we encounter the mechanical coldness of the systems that governed it. The mail-order bride was a cog in a machine that she could not comprehend and from which she could never escape. Her life was a testament to the power of the lie and the fragility of the human spirit in the face of an indifferent universe. The frontier was not a place of beginning, but a place of ending, the end of illusions, the end of dignity, and the end of the person who had once hoped for something more than a burrow in the dirt. The legacy of the Wild West is written in the blood of the birthing bed and the filth of the sod house, a narrative of survival that owes nothing to romance and everything to the primal instinct to endure. We are the descendants of the survivors, the heirs to a genetic memory of betrayal and hardship that continues to shape our perception of the world. The false portraits and the lying letters are still with us, hidden in the archives of our history, waiting for someone with a cold enough heart to read them for what they truly are. They are the evidence of a crime that was committed in the name of progress, a crime for which there has never been a trial and for which there will never be a resolution. Ultimately, the story of the West is a story of decay, the decay of the landscape, the decay of the body, and the decay of the social contracts that bind us together. The mail-order bride system was the quintessential expression of this rot, a way to turn the most fundamental human desires into tools of exploitation. As the wind howls across the empty plains where the dugouts once stood, it carries with it the faint, lingering scent of that old desperation. The frontier has been conquered, the trains have been replaced by highways, and the sod houses have returned to the earth, but the darkness of that era remains, a permanent shadow on the soul of the nation. The pathologist's report is complete, the body of the 19th century has been dissected, and the cause of death is clear, a lethal infection of greed, masked by the symptoms of a desperate hope. The Wild West was not a dream, but a fever, a violent and grimy episode in the history of the species that we have spent over 100 years trying to forget. But as long as those old photographs exist, with their frozen lies and their haunted eyes, the truth will continue to bubble up from the soil. Love was replaced by a stamp, hope was replaced by a false image, and the woman in the dirt remains the only honest thing in a landscape built on a foundation of sand.